Welcome to this evening's lecture, sponsored by the George Rodrigue Annual Lecture on Louisiana Culture and the Arts, and the Flora Levy-Plonsky-Levy Endowment in the Humanities. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to call upon Professor Charles Richard of the UL English Department to announce a special dedication for tonight's lecture.
Thank you very much, Jack. I want to read some words at the request of Maurice Duquesne. These are his words. And Maurice, of course, if you don't know this, he's been the coordinator for the Levy Lecture and the Rodrigue Lecture now for many, many years. And he's been working tirelessly all through those years to bring marvelous guests like ours tonight to campus. So let me first ask that we give Maurice a round of applause for the hard work he's done. Tonight we honor the memory of George Bradley as an esteemed faculty member of the English department, our colleague of 31 years. George was a man of great intellectual gifts who cultivated a passion for language, literature, theology, and politics, all of which shaped his teaching and commanded the admiration of his students and colleagues alike. His stewardship as a teacher went beyond the classroom. He was blessed with an inborn charity that prompted him to reach into his own pocket, often in denial of his own needs, to help students who suffered financial hardship. Once, a faculty member chided him for this prodigal generosity of his toward a student who wasn't really so much in economic need as he was prone to drinking up all of his disposable income. George responded to his colleague who criticized that, and he said, "That may be, but I would rather suffer being misled by 9 students than fail to help one genuinely in need." During the 1960s, the English department was located in the old library, today's Stevens Hall, and there was a coffee lounge there. George became a fixture in that small lounge. On any given morning, he could be found there, sitting at the table, with copies of journals and newspapers, reading articles with scrupulous attention and underlining passages. He amused the rest of us by pointing out the errors he found in diction and usage among the publications of journalists and scholars far more distinguished than us. He also delighted in sharing with us the topical and often subtle comedy in some of the New Yorker's cartoons. George had a marvelous sense of humor. In our little coffee lounge, 2 faculty members would often engage in a long-standing argument, with one defending Freud and the other defending Jung. These debates sometimes grew quite vocal and spilled out into the hallway, causing some alarm among the students waiting for class. To them, it seemed that violence might break out behind the lounge door at any moment. Passing in the hall one day, George sensed the students' worries and broke the tension with laughter, reassuring them that there was nothing to fear. Mutt and Jeff were just at it again. I recall, this is of course Maurice's words, I recall especially something that George said when a faculty member criticized John Kennedy Toole, the author of the satirical novel Confederacy of Dunces. Toole had been one of our own here in the English department in 1959, and this colleague complained about Toole's modeling the book's characters too closely on the flaws and eccentricities of certain faculty members whom Toole had known when he taught here. The professor complained that he disliked Toole for his habit of ridiculing everyone he met. Very diplomatically, George replied, "An appetite for mocking the flaws and follies in others is often just an escape from recognizing one's own flaws and follies. By their fruits ye shall know them," as the biblical injunction reads. So tonight we honor George Bradley for the rich abundance of the fruits of his career, as a scholar, as a humanist, and as a most generous teacher in every sense. Thank you for joining us tonight in celebrating his memory.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. In a similar light, I wanted to mention that we have quite a few members of extended members of the Bradley family here for us tonight, including his daughter, Monica Tozan, and her husband Kevin, and also a son, Tim and his wife, who I just met, whose name I forgot. And they're here, and there's quite a few cousins here as well. So there's quite a Bradley cheering section here, and we're really glad to have you here at this occasion. Also, we want to do a call out to the Sacred Heart students who are here from Sacred Heart Academy in Grand Coteau with their instructor, Roxanne Guillory, one of my former students, I remember, I think. She remembers it more clearly than I do, I think, at this point. But we've been really blessed with the Sacred Heart Academy sending students to these lectures for a number of years, and Dr. Duquesne also certainly appreciates that. We are delighted to have with us this evening Dr. Victor Holtkamp of Tulane University's Department of Theater and Dance. A native of Washington State, Professor Holtkamp earned dual degrees in history and drama at the University of Washington, a master's degree from Brown University, and completed his PhD in drama at the University of Washington in 2003. Before coming to Tulane in 2012, he taught for 5 years at the University of South Carolina. He has presented at national and international conferences and published on topics ranging from the apocryphal Shakespearean play Musidorus to the musical A Chorus Line. And he has been a dramaturge, a director, an actor, and dancer in a theatrical career extending back over 20 years. At Tulane, he currently teaches classes in theater history and dramaturgy. His book, Interchangeable Parts, Acting in Industry and Technology in U.S. Theater, will be published by the University of Michigan Press in the fall of this year. His lecture is entitled Tennessee Williams, New Orleans, Fabrication, and Faith. Please welcome Dr. Holtkamp.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for those warm words of welcome. Especially thanks to those of you who had just discovered spring break starts very soon, so thank you very much for coming out to the theater tonight. I know there's like a small orbit around which you can best hear me with the microphone, so I'll try and keep my head as still as possible. Again, thank you for inviting me here. It is a singular pleasure to be able to share some thoughts on Tennessee Williams with you. As the introduction said, I am currently living in New Orleans. I teach at Tulane, and that's actually where I picked one of the three areas to try to slice through what is, I'm going to see if I can, it's a little better, right? Perfect. So, which is one of the three ways that I tried to slice through what is, quite frankly, a daunting body of material that Tennessee Williams amassed over the course of his career. And also be touching on themes of fabulation or storytelling and faith as we go through stuff. And all three of them are linked to a certain extent for me, and what I'd also like to do is just draw out a few things that are part of what might be called sort of the larger Williams mythos, themes, characters, types, concerns that interweave themselves through a number of different pieces, not just the full-length plays. Because he has written so much stuff, I need to apologize in advance if a particular scene or play of yours is not mentioned tonight. I apologize. I just had to make some cuts. So, to begin, it's worth removing a few key moments from Williams' own biography as Williams stands apart in a somewhat crowded field as a playwright whose own life and experience informed his own works. Born Thomas Lanier Williams III, his namesake, a relative on his father's side, was a politician of some note in Tennessee. He arrived less than 2 years after his older sister Rose was born. There's a couple photos of them as children up there. At the time of his birth, his mother, Edwina, was living with her parents in Columbus, Mississippi. Tom's father, the somewhat macabrely named Cornelius Coffin Williams, was working as a traveling salesman and so was often away from home, as he was when he was courting Edwina when he worked for the telephone company. And of course, he shows up in The Glass Menagerie as the telephone man who fell in love with long distance. Edwina, Rose, and Tom moved with Edwina's parents as Tom's grandfather, an Episcopal priest, moved from parish to parish, and Tennessee recalled his early childhood with a great deal of fondness. Things changed when the nuclear family moved to St. Louis in 1918 when Cornelius got a job at the International Shoe Company as a manager. The transition was difficult, to say the least. Tom, who at age 5 that's right over there, had suffered a bout of diphtheria, which was so intense that he required nearly a year of convalescence. And this left him somewhat physically frail, and he was also sensitive, for lack of a better term, and he did not match the elder William's idea of what his ideal son should be like. Cornelius, it should also be said, was an active alcoholic at this time, and this did nothing to improve the family situation. A year after arriving in St. Louis, Tom and Rose's younger brother, Walter Dakin Williams was born, sorry. The year after that, 1920, Williams returned to his grandparents' house to attend school for a year away from St. Louis. Tom returned and finished school in St. Louis, and at age 12, he received a typewriter as a gift from his mother, and this he credits with starting him on his career as a writer, a habit of daily writing which he would maintain with remarkable regularity throughout his life. Whatever the status of the many demons that haunted him, personal, interpersonal, or otherwise, there was barely a day that Williams wasn't writing or rewriting something that he would rework, borrow, or meld into more writings to come. In his first attempt at college, he failed his ROTC class and he was pulled out of school. His father got him a job at the shoe warehouse. It was not Tom's ideal employment, as you might well guess. And in 1935, finally breaking from the shoe warehouse for a while summering with his grandparents in Memphis, Williams had his first play produced. It was called Cairo, Shanghai, Bombay, with exclamation points. You can almost imagine the musical in front of you, and it concerned the shenanigans of sailors traveling from port to port. This was a far cry from the stages that would see his work in the future, but it was something, and Williams himself was even on stage playing a sort of cartoon blind man, complete with cane and cup and a little dog to roll around the stage with. 2 years later, in 1937, Williams had two more plays produced by a group called the Mummers in St. Louis, and he returned to school at the University of Iowa and earned a BA in English in 1938. In 1938, the group Theater announced a playwriting contest. They were seeking an original work by a young author. Now, the group was the most prestigious theater company of the 1930s, boasting alumna like Stella Adler, Harold Clurman, Sanford Meisner, Lee Strasberg, Carl Malden, and Elia Kazan, among many others. The winner of the play contest would receive $500, which is, to be brutally honest, a pretty decent prize for a playwriting competition today, and pretty impressive money in the 1930s, and so Williams was enticed. However, the stipulation that the author be young was a potential hurdle for Williams, for the rules specified that the authors be under the age of 25. Born in 1911, Williams was 27 at the time. In his later retellings, he said he felt justified lowering his age because his 2 years working at the shoe company shouldn't count. He had, in his metaphorical back pocket, a set of one-acts that he collectively titled American Blues. Having already decided to leave St. Louis for New Orleans, the plan was to stop and see his grandparents in Memphis, mail the plays from there, putting their address as his own, and signing the name Tennessee Williams to the works, and giving a birth year of 1914. What could go wrong, and quite frankly, how much difference would it possibly make, was his thought process at the time. And so, Thomas Lanier Williams left St. Louis on December 26, 1938, stopped in Memphis, mailed an envelope full of one-act plays to the group theater, and continued on his way to the city of New Orleans. He arrived in the city with a suitcase, a portable typewriter, a portable record player, a collection of poems by Hart Crane, and he checked into a hotel just off Lee Circle for his first night there. The next night, he moved to a hotel in the French Quarter for $4 a week, which was actually a fair bit of money. He had inadvertently arrived during the Sugar Bowl, and so rooms were scarce, and as one who has only a glancing attention paid to football and has been caught behind barricades myself, I have some sympathy for him in that sense. And then once the football crowd retreated, he managed to get a rooming house for $10 a month. By this time, he had made his third move, and he started signing the registers, not Thomas Williams, but Tennessee Williams, writer. Tennessee Williams did not win the playwriting contest. However, the prize committee had been so struck by Williams' theatrical voice that they recommended he receive a special $100 prize. Williams was quite pleased, but he was also worried that his deception would be discovered, and multiple biographers note the discrepancy between Thomas and Tennessee's birth year as a continuing point of worry for the author, who at times told his agents to tell reporters to not bring up his age under any circumstances whatsoever. Despite decamping from St. Louis to New Orleans, Williams hadn't stayed in the city all that long. By February of 1939, Williams was on the road with a new friend, driving cross-country to the West Coast. And though he would return to the city many times after that, he was already gone by the time he'd won the prize. The telegram caught up with him in Culver City, California, where he had hoped that the recognition would allow him to get a studio contract as a writer during what was the golden age of Hollywood. However, the impact of New Orleans, and in particular this particular time in New Orleans on his life and work, and a number of elements from his experiences there, appear in his plays and stories outsized to the amount of time he was physically in the city. And it is some of the echoes of that city that I'd like to turn to now. Williams' professional career took off with the 1943 Chicago and then Broadway production of The Glass Menagerie, which was set in St. Louis, but his follow-up traced his geographic journey. In 1947's A Streetcar Named Desire, set firmly in New Orleans. When he was asked by Mike Wallace in an interview years later why he chose to move to New Orleans, his answer was simply St. Louis. For Williams, New Orleans offered freedom from what he called his Puritan upbringing. It was in New Orleans that Williams seems to have come out to himself, experiencing and accepting his homosexuality, a process that was aided by the cosmopolitan nature of the French Quarter, and as he put his own sense of the city and the pieces he set there as he continued to work with the remarkable material he encountered. Streetcar is, at its core, a quartet, for those of you that have been a little while perhaps. Sisters Stella and Blanche Dubois, Stella's husband Stanley, and Mitch, Stanley's friend and almost fiancé of Blanche. Blanche has arrived in New Orleans and taken the titular streetcar to arrive at the cramped apartment of her sister and Stanley in the Faubourg Maronay neighborhood, upriver from the French Quarter. Blanche has come bearing bad tidings. The rest of the Dubois family is dead, and the family estate, unsubtly named Belle Reve, has been lost. Blanche has come to stay with Stella for an indeterminate amount of time. Close quarters wear on everyone, and Stanley in particular, with a propensity towards domestic violence, is hardly a fan of an additional adult in the house. When it looks like Mitch and Blanche may be getting serious, Stanley looks into Blanche's past and reports that after Belle Reve was lost, she became increasingly dissolute, sleeping with many men, and losing her position as a teacher after getting mixed up with a 17-year-old student. Williams had constructed the marriage to Mitch as Blanche's lifeline, and it is this that Stanley severs, presenting Blanche with a bus ticket back to Laurel, Mississippi, her place of purgatory. Later that night, Stella goes into labor, and when Stanley returns from the hospital, his arguments with Blanche escalate to rape, and this, coupled with Stella's refusal to credit the truth of her sister's accusations, drives Blanche insane. When the doctor and nurse arrive to take Blanche to the sanitarium, Blanche offers one of the more quotable lines from a play not lacking in them, "I've always depended on the kindness of strangers." New Orleans is present in the play from the first stage direction. Quote, "The exterior of a two-story corner building on a street in New Orleans, which is named Elysian Fields and runs between the L&N tracks and the river. The section is poor, but unlike corresponding sections in other American cities, it has a raffish charm." After saying that you can almost feel the warm breath of the brown river beyond the river warehouses with their faint redolence of bananas and coffee, which, as someone who has worked in the theater, let me tell you, is a difficult stage direction to fully realize on stage. He goes on to link the essence of the city to black culture. A corresponding air is evoked by the music of Negro entertainers at a bar room around the corner. In this part of New Orleans, you are practically always just around the corner or a few doors down the street from a tinny piano being played with the infatuated fluency of brown fingers. This blue piano expresses the spirit of the life which goes on here. To emphasize this point, Williams opens the play with two women, one white and one colored, in his words, taking the air on the steps of the building. The white woman is Eunice, upstairs neighbor to Stella and Stanley. The other is unnamed and does not occupy a major role in the drama to come, but it was clearly an important marker of New Orleans-ness for Williams to be so specific about the race of the women playing the parts, explaining in the stage directions that New Orleans is a cosmopolitan city, where there is a relatively warm and easy intermingling of races in the old part of town. It is into this milieu that Blanche is unceremoniously ejected, her appearance incongruous to the setting in Williams' description. "They told me to take a streetcar named Desire and then transfer to one called Cemeteries and ride 6 blocks and get off at Elysian Fields." The poetry and Gothic foreboding of New Orleans street names served Williams well here and likely helped convince him to set the story there. In earlier drafts of the piece, the setting was the same as his first big hit, St. Louis. He had also considered Chicago and Mississippi until he finally set the Kowalskis down in the Maroney. In a 2004 early one-act version of the play, an early one-act version of the play was unearthed from the archives and performed in New Orleans. Called Interior Panic, the dating of the script is sometime in 1945 to 46, and so relatively close to the fully realized opening of Streetcar in 47. Here, Williams had committed to the city, though more generally than in Streetcar, describing the setting simply as the interior of a shotgun cottage in a poor section of New Orleans. Interior Panic is far more expressionistic than the final version of the play that audiences saw in the 40s, with Blanche, here named Blanche Shannon instead of Dubois, serving as the viewpoint through which the audience witnesses the action. Blanche's sister is here named Grace Faber, whose husband Jack is far more patient than the stage Stanley we are more familiar with. Colors, sounds, and actions are visually and orally distorted in Williams' description, viewed through the deteriorating senses of Blanche, who is shown to be already half out of her head. Yet for all of Blanche Shannon's damage, Interior Panic ends on a more hopeful note than Streetcar, with Blanche's suitor, here named George, arriving at the end to take Blanche out on a date. Williams loved New Orleans, but was clear-eyed about the limits of its romanticization. In a 1943 but published in 1948 short story, The Angel in the Alcove, he describes life as a resident of a cheap rooming house in the old French quarter of New Orleans with a window facing out on Bourbon Street itself. We are a long ways from the luxury digs uptown here, with the landlady often entering our narrator's room with the newspaper to, quote, read aloud some item concerning an act of crime in the quarter, with the apparent intention of determining if the criminal was the narrator himself. The landlady's suspicious nature is justified somewhat by Williams, as she is described as a victim of deadbeats. None of her tenants were regular payers. The equivocal vivacity that attends Williams' characters in Streetcar are far darker here, with few far ameliorating elements against the wrath of unkindness and ill fate. In this story, Williams describes a homosexual encounter with a tubercular artist who lived next door to him, and then, not long after, the artist's unceremonious eviction by the landlady. Not for the lovemaking, but because his TB had progressed such that in the landlady's description, you leave a trail of blood everywhere that you go, a bloody track like a chicken that runs with its head cut off. I know about you degenerates, she continues, warming to the fight. I ain't let rooms 10 years in the quarter for nothing. A bunch of rotten half-breeds and drunks and degenerates, that's what I've had to cope with. But you're the worst of the bunch, barring none. In tone, her voice is remarkably similar to Stanley's berating Blanche in Streetcar, but here it is not the sexual proclivities of the recipient of the harangue that spark the confrontation, but the physical degeneracy of a real disease. Note, too, that the landlady does not seem to partake in the easy relations between the races, as Williams describes them in the old part of the city and the Marigny, as the half-breeds are lumped into the same category as the drunks and degenerates. Finally, a one-act published in 1953 captures some of the flavor of The Angel in the Alcove. Titled The Lady of Larkspur Lotion, our action is, familiarly, a rooming house in the quarter, and our cast of three comprises a no-nonsense landlady, a pitiful woman of flexible morality, and an impoverished writer dreaming of a more poetic world. The landlady is another vision of Angel's hard-nosed, flinty-eyed matron, here named Mrs. Wire. Our primary tenant is a skewed reflection of Blanche's time in the wilderness of Laurel, Mississippi, named Mrs. Hardwick Moore, and the writer is credited simply as the writer. The setting is described as a wretchedly furnished room in the French Quarter of New Orleans. There are no windows, the room being a cubicle, partitioned off from several others by imitation walls. And the curtain rises on Mrs. Hardwick Moore, a dyed blonde woman of 40, seated passively on the edge of the bed. Enter Mrs. Wire, and Mrs. Hardwick Moore begins to harangue her about the cockroaches, particularly about the fact that the cockroaches she encounters are the flying kind, which, again, to be fair, moving from Washington State was also an adjustment I needed to make. But this complaint is quickly shown to be an attempted feint, easily dismissed by Mrs. Wire with a quick, flying cockroaches are nothing to be surprised at. They have them all over, even uptown they have them. Which is also true. It is the rent Mrs. Wire seeks to collect, though not before noting the bottle of Larkspur lotion on the dresser, in its time a cure for body vermin, with a strong intimation that one might get these vermin through intimate contact. Our heroine cannot pay the rent because, again echoing Blanche's belief in Shep Huntley riding to the rescue, her monies have not been forwarded from the man who is taking care of the rubber plantation, At which point Mrs. Wire interrupts with, "I've heard enough of that goddamn rubber plantation. The Brazilian rubber plantation. You think I've been in business 17 years without learning nothing about your kind of woman?" As an angel, it is not a moral judgment that has brought Mrs. Wire to her door. A constant in Williams' portrayals of New Orleans is its relative lack of censure for what elsewhere would be considered indecent, immoral, or illegal behavior. "The first thing a landlady in the French Quarter learns," Mrs. Wire explains, "is not to see and not to hear, but only to collect your money. As long as that comes in," she goes on, "I'm blind, I'm deaf, I'm dumb. But as soon as it stops, I recover my hearing and also my sight and also the use of my voice." The landlady has overheard an argument between Mrs. Hardwick Moore and a certain gentleman caller the previous night over payments for services rendered. "I heard no mention of a Brazilian rubber plantation, but plenty of other things were plainly referred to in that little midnight conversation you had." Into the breach charges the writer. "Stop persecuting this woman," he yells. The arrival of the writer sends Mrs. Wire on a generalized tirade against the denizens of the neighborhood. "I'm done with deadbeats. Now, is it plain to you? Completely fed up with all you quarter rats, half-breeds, drunkards, degenerates who try to get by on promises, lies, delusions." Again, it's clear that Williams is cribbing from his own material here. The writer banishes Mrs. Wire, who insists that both of them pay the rent by tomorrow or they will be both kicked out. Their future uncertain, the writer shares a whiskey bottle with Mrs. Hardwick Moore, who gratefully accepts and asks his name, to which he replies, "Chekhov. Anton Pavlovich Chekhov." Mrs. Hardwick Moore is described as smiling with the remnants of coquetry and showing no surprise that a dead Russian stage genius has been living next door to her in a flophouse, says only, "Thank you, Mr. Chekhov," and the play ends. And this play serves as a fine transition to fabulation. The writer is not Chekhov, of course, whom Williams counted among his strongest influences, but Williams, albeit Williams who is not yet Tennessee Williams, but another artist who has washed up on the shores of the Mississippi and found refuge among the lowly, living amongst what we know to be palmetto bugs, but to audiences who have not spent much time here are likely best described as flying cockroaches. Yet this writer character is notable not only for his occupation and his oblique connection to the conflict between Mrs. Wire and Mrs. Hardwick Moore, but for his stirring defense of dreaming another world into being when the real one proves disappointing. In his defense of Mrs. Hardwick Moore, he says, "Is there no mercy left in the world anymore? What has become of compassion and understanding? Where have they all gone to? Where's God? Where's Christ? What if there is no Brazilian rubber plantation? What if there is no rubber king in her life? There ought to be rubber kings in her life. Is she to be blamed because it is necessary for her to compensate for the cruel deficiencies of reality by the existence of a little, what shall I say, God-given imagination?" And then, having shoved Mrs. Wire out of the room, and before proffering the whiskey bottle, he engages Mrs. Hardwick Moore on the subject of her Brazilian rubber plantation with, it must be generously conceded, an exceedingly fanciful geography. Beginning with the assertion that there must have been no roaches on the plantation, to which she replies, "No, of course there weren't. Everything was immaculate always, always." He then asks, "How far was it from the Mediterranean?" "Only a mile or two," comes the response. Assenting without question, he continues, "On a very clear morning, I dare say it was possible to distinguish the white chalk cliffs of Dover. Across the channel?" "Yes," she says, "in very clear weather it was." She doesn't say it, but you can hear the same sentiment that we were left with at the end of Streetcar. Here is someone who is always, or at least now, depends on the kindness of strangers. Blanche, like the Lady of Larkspur Lotion, has woven a skein of stories to enfold herself in. Scene 5 of Streetcar opens with Blanche composing a letter to the likely fictional Shep Huntley. "Most of my sister's friends go north in the summer, but some have homes on the Gulf, and there has been a continued round of entertainments, teas, cocktails, and luncheons." Scene 7, set on Blanche's birthday, offers another view of the same theme. As Stanley reveals the truth of Blanche's past indiscretions to Stella, she is singing off stage, "It's only a paper moon," which Williams directs to be used contrapuntally to the revelations of reality happening on stage. "Say it's only a paper moon," she sings, "sailing over a cardboard sea. But it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me." Williams is not pulling any punches here. This is the dream meeting the reality, the storyteller facing the limits of their power. What if there is no Shep Huntley? Doesn't Blanche, Williams suggests, deserve it? Williams knew all too well the dangers of believing in the dream too strongly, of not minding the gaps between what we wish and what we have. The artist in Angel denies his TB, despite the toll it's taking on his body. Elsewhere, the fractured nature of Blanche of interior panic, to say nothing of the eventual destruction of Blanche of Streetcar, illustrate the perils Williams perceived in becoming wholly untethered to the world. Yet, for all that, his compassion for dreamers, storytellers, fabulists, and here he includes himself surely among them, is vibrant and contributes to our feeling that we are catching glimpses of Williams even where we might not expect to look. But he could also be quite obvious. It did this in his later play Vieux Carré, which opened in 1977, though it would be more accurate to say that this play was both one of his last and one of his first. He started working on it in 1939 while he was first in New Orleans. The eventual script of Vieux Carré has Williams weaving together so many impulses, stories, and characters that appear elsewhere in his canon that it feels at times like stumbling into a bizarre family reunion of Williams' very peculiar psyche. Here, in the first pages, we meet the character known as the writer. Here, too, is the tubercular artist in the adjoining garret from the Angel short story and the irascible Mrs. Wire from Larkspur and Angel, guarding the honor of her boarders by refusing to sleep in her room, but instead camping on a cot at the foot of the stairs to inspect both her tenants and those they might wish to accompany them to their rooms. It is her guardianship that prevents the artist, now bequeathed the suggestive name Nightingale. Aside from the more prosaic references to the bird, as a denizen of the night, Nightingale was also, according to certain scholars, Williams' own code word for sexual climax, from bringing his pickup upstairs. Despite Nightingale's protestations that the young man whose name he can almost recall is, in fact, a long-lost cousin in town only for a day, naturally necessitating a long and serious confab on family business that would stretch deep into the night, Mrs. Wire does not buy it, and the cousin is sent packing. His prospective conquest thwarted, Nightingale, as in the short story, enters the writer's room. But whereas in the short story the artist almost wordlessly brushes aside the narrator's hesitation, insisting only, I want to, so I lay back, the narrator continues, and let him do what he wanted to until he was finished. In the play, the scene is now much more fully realized. Here, Nightingale engages the writer in conversation, sussing out whether his inclinations might be compatible with his own. Eventually, the writer confesses his one singular male-male experience prior, a New Orleans New Year's Eve encounter with, somewhat fantastically, a paratrooper. With a sense of both heartbreak and nostalgia for the relative innocence of his youth, Williams has the writer reveal that his reaction to his seduction was to confess his love for the soldier, a protestation that is greeted with laughter by the object of his affection. Yet Nightingale does not laugh. Love can happen like that, the artist generally concedes, for one night only. And soon after, Nightingale and the writer find their own night of love. Alongside the writer and Nightingale are Jane and Ty, mutated doppelgangers of Stella and Stanley, whose fundamental carnal dynamic is, in Vieux Carré, equally apparent, as is the dangerous attraction Ty Stanley has on both Jane and the writer. He even argues about property rights, though does not, as Stanley does, invoke the Napoleonic Code. I live here, he says about the room he shares with Jane, and if I live in a place, I got equal rights to the place. The Williams family reunion is even more extended than it seems at first glance. The angel is revealed to be, or believed to be, which here amounts to nearly the same thing, the spirit of Grand herself, Williams' beloved, deceased grandmother. When the writer confronts Nightingale racked with the final stages of TB, he directs him to keep his eyes on the alcove. She might come in here before you fall asleep. My mother's mother, Grand. Even Williams' mother makes a cameo as one of the tourists who flock to the courtyard of the rooming house for the Azalea Festival calls out, Edwina, Edwina, come see this dream of a little courtyard. Oh my, yes, like a dream. And like Williams' own first time in New Orleans, the play ends with the writer departing on a road trip to the West Coast. Vieux Carré tells the story of Tennessee's adventures in New Orleans when he had newly christened himself as writer and as Tennessee. The Glass Menagerie is when Tennessee was still Tom. The Williams are now the Wingfields, with his mother becoming the fading belle Amanda Wingfield and his sister Rose transmuted into Laura, though with Laura's nickname of Blue Roses, she is still Rose after a fashion. The family is set down in a semi-squalid apartment in St. Louis, just as they were as children when Cornelius became manager at the International Shoe Company, and Tom in the play is also a writer, desperately working when he can and going to the movies. Yet for all that is directly drawn from his own life, Williams is unconcerned with a factually accurate recounting of his own history. The scene is memory, he tells would-be producers in his opening stage directions, and is therefore non-realistic. Tom's opening lines to the audience speak to the same impulse. I am the opposite of a stage magician, he claims. He gives you illusion that has the appearance of truth. I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion. Glass Menagerie tells the story of the ill-fated matchmaking of Laura to Jim O'Connor, the gentleman caller Tom brings home from the shoe warehouse. Like Mitch in Streetcar, O'Connor is the lifeboat for Laura, whose desperately shy nature has caused her to drop out of secretarial school, leaving her without employment or prospects. In Menagerie, Laura is, through no fault of her own or Jim's, bereft, as Jim, unbeknownst to Tom, is already engaged and came to dinner guilelessly, invited by his friend. It is the drama that plays out between Laura and Amanda that occupies Tom's attention. True to form, Williams' stand-in is off-center for much of the action. Yet when the truth comes out after dinner and Jim O'Connor has departed the Wingfield apartment, Amanda rounds on Tom. You live in a dream, you manufacture illusions. Her anger could seem misplaced. After all, Laura managed to make it through without throwing up on anyone, which she could not do at secretarial school, and certainly, given some distance, it could be seen that a successful dinner party might again be tried with some other more eligible young man. But it is Williams' genius as a writer that such prosaic considerations are swept aside. Like an illusionist promising to make something vanish, he laid out the significance of the evening early on. Having a poet's weakness for symbols, I am using this character, Jim, as a symbol, as the long-delayed but always expected something we live for. Jim's departure stands in for the larger series of failures that Tom confesses he was not there to see. By his account, he went farther than the moon, for time is the longest distance between two places. Yet his flight cannot remove him from his sister, for her spirit haunts him wherever he goes. I tried to leave you behind me, but I am more faithful than I intended to be, he says. An earlier incarnation of the piece, or perhaps more accurately a variation on it, a one-act titled The Pretty Trap, dates from 1943-44, so its composition is quite close to the opening of Menagerie. Despite this, the script was first published in 2006, with an inaugural production in 2011 by Southern Rep in New Orleans. The play is essentially the dinner party section of Menagerie, and aside from Jim O'Connor being Jim Delaney, the character names are consistent. Yet here, as in Interior Panic, Williams offers the promise of a happier ending. Instead of revealing that Jim is married, in The Pretty Trap, he is single, and the kiss between him and Laura is not one of experienced inducting the innocent. The embrace endures, Williams describes, with a curious, hesitant intensity only possible between two people who have never really kissed before. Amanda grants her willing permission for the two to go for a walk, laughingly insisting that they be back before midnight. After they leave, she allows herself a triumphant laugh, seeing vindication in her plan to get Laura settled in a family. Explaining this to Tom, she says, "Girls are a pretty trap. That's what they've always been and will always be, even when dreams plus action take over the world. Now, dreamy type, let's finish the dishes." The vision of domestic harmony resolves the tensions brought up earlier in the play, and like Blanche's mysterious suitor in panic arriving to take her away, as an audience we believe that things will be all right now for Laura. But neither one-act ending was what Williams chose for the full-length versions of his stories. Questions of dramatic intensity aside, it was, of course, his beloved sister Rose's story that Williams was addressing. Williams himself described Rose as an ordinary teenage girl trying to cope with extraordinary circumstances as she began a descent into what would eventually be diagnosed as schizophrenia. Notoriously, Williams disagreed with his mother over the best course of treatment, but was overruled, and Rose was given a partial lobotomy in 1943. This ameliorated some of her difficulties, but did not, of course, remove the underlying pathology, and she was never able to live independently. Williams scholar Michael Poller writes that just as in the Glass Menagerie, Tom is never able to bid Laura goodbye, no matter how far from home he travels, Williams' career can be seen as an attempt to say farewell to Rose in play after play, story after story. The happier life promised the Laura of Pretty Trap is revoked in Menagerie. Amanda's desperate dreaming of a new reality for her daughter was ultimately frustrated. The success of Menagerie, however, ensured that Rose if she couldn't live on her own, that she would at least be taken care of. Williams made sure that she received excellent care throughout her life, and, dying before her, established a trust that would continue to pay for her care until she died, at which point the remaining funds would be bequeathed to the College of the South. By telling her story, Williams put himself in a position to rescue Rose from the worst that the world might throw at her. And it is this success that takes me into the third part of tonight's triptych, faith. Williams had been working for success for years when Menagerie opened. His follow-up with Streetcar cemented his place, fame, and fortune. And he realized that he needed to appraise what life after such success might mean, what pretty traps he might need to avoid. In a disarmingly frank essay titled A Streetcar Named Success, he framed the question starkly, in religious terms. Once you fully apprehend the vacuity of a life without struggle, you are equipped with the basic means of salvation. Williams' relationship to organized religion was, let's say, uneven at best. New Orleans offered a release from what he described as his Puritan upbringing. His grandfather, as mentioned, was a man of the cloth, serving as an Episcopal priest, and in his youth, Williams had perforce lived in church rectories and parsonages when living with his mother's parents. Towards the end of his life, Williams became an official, though hardly devout, Roman Catholic, being inducted into the faith fittingly at the Our Lady Star of the Sea Church in Key West. This was apparently urged on by his brother Dakin, who also arranged for a full requiem and Roman Catholic burial in St. Louis after he died. His own wishes, ignored in this instance, were to be cremated and buried at sea in roughly the same place where another of his literary heroes, Hart Crane, had taken his own life. Despite his mutable personal beliefs, Williams is more than happy to take advantage of the potency of religion and religious imagery in his works. Angel in the Alcove is angel, after all, and not apparition. And religious themes and references show up with remarkable regularity throughout his career, albeit with a large grain of salt and healthy dose of questioning. Take the character of Nightingale from Vieux Carré. When the writer suggests he see a doctor for his TB, Nightingale replies, "My faith's in Christ, not doctors," followed up with, "God's got to give me more time for serious work. Even God has moral obligations, don't he? Well, don't he?" To which the writer responds, "I think that morals are a human invention that he ignores as successfully as we do." Perhaps surprisingly, Nightingale is shocked. Christ, that's evil, that's infidel talk. And after genuflecting, he continues, "I'm a Catholic believer. A priest would say you've fallen from grace, boy." And then, a page later, "Foxes have holes, but the Son of Man hath nowhere to hide his head." This faith, needless to say, does not offer earthly salvation for Nightingale. A storytelling model notably analyzed by Joseph Campbell in Hero with a Thousand Faces argues that in many of the great stories, religious and otherwise, the hero or heroes face a quest to exceed their initial worldview, venture into the beyond, and then return, a state identified as being the master of two worlds. For Williams, the two worlds are often the poles of spirituality and earthbound sensuality. In Night of the Iguana, the characters are shown at various stages of their own hero's journey, and the toll it has taken on each, while different, is pronounced. Another useful storytelling model here is the arc of the Passion Play, summarized by theater scholar Ellie Fuchs as a character or characters moving from suffering to rebirth. Christ suffered, descended into the world of the dead, and returned to the land of the living, triumphant over both. And it is this grand journey, albeit in somewhat reduced scale, that Williams tackles in Night of the Iguana. The play opened in 1961. We're at the Costa Verde Hotel and Resort, perched up above both the beach and the road leading to the resort itself in Mexico. The rooms here, off the beaten track, are small and are described evocatively as cubicles, the same word Williams used 2 decades prior to describe the accommodations in the rooming houses in the French Quarter. While the level of squalor is far different, the emotional connections and dynamics at times remain remarkably similar. When we first meet the manager of the resort, Mrs. Maxine Falk, she is described as affable and rapaciously lusty, and she is our representative of the bodily plane of existence. Almost as soon as we see Maxine, she sees Lawrence T. Shannon off stage, and they begin a yelled conversation with each other. Shannon is a tour guide and has brought a busload of women, school teachers at a Baptist female college in Blowing Rock, Texas, and wants to unload them on Maxine for a few days while he recovers. His nervous state, in Williams' description, is terribly apparent. He is a young man who has cracked up before and is going to crack up again, perhaps repeatedly. Shannon is nursing a fever and has compounded his problems by having slept with the one student that came along with the teachers. As Maxine puts it, "You took the young chick, and the old hens are squawking about it." Further, Shannon is haunted by a specter, notably not described here as an angel, but a spook, a manifestation, symptom, or indicator of his precarious mental state. The interior panic version of Blanche, it might be recalled, was Blanche Shannon rather than Dubois. The other terrifying figures in the play are a family of literal Nazis. The time is 1939, the Battle of Britain is in full tilt, and as Maxine says, Mexico is the front door to South America and the back door to the States. There's a lot of them running around. In their first appearance, they are described as a little animated cartoon by Hieronymus Bosch by Shannon, and Williams himself makes them figures tinged with unreality as they make a, quote, startling, dreamlike entrance upon the scene, and adding to the insanity, Fräulein Frockenhop is directed to enter astride a big inflated rubber horse, which is used as an aid for swimming. Seemingly opposite Maxine is Hannah Jelks, who will eventually prove to be further along her heroine's journey with an ability to cross between the planes of earth and heaven. Hannah is remarkable looking, says Williams' stage directions, ethereal, almost ghostly. She suggests a Gothic cathedral image of a medieval saint, but animated. Again, a difficult stage direction to pull off in real life. She has arrived here looking for a place to stay with her grandfather. Having been assured of vacancy, she heads back down the hill to collect him, clearing the way for Maxine and Mrs. Fellows to return. His confrontation with Mrs. Fellows, the ringleader of tour discontent, continues, and in between haranguing him for his failures as a tour guide, she emphasizes that he is a defrocked priest before storming back down the hill in an effort to get the group back to Acapulco. Like a seesaw up from the road comes Hannah and her grandfather, Nono, a nickname shared purposefully with William's own grandfather, and with a last name, Coffin, that not only foreshadows his own demise, but repeats William's own father, with whom he had actually achieved a sort of reconciliation before his death, which was prior to the play being completed. Like Hannah, Nono is also an artist, specifically a poet, and we find out that the two of them travel and make a living by selling their wares. He declaims poetry, and Hannah sells caricatures and pre-made watercolors. With this, the representatives of earthly delight and transcendent experience are put in conflict, with Shannon as the battleground. Maxine is almost immediately aware of the threat to her claim on him and tries to block Hannah and Nono from staying, but Shannon advocates on their behalf. This, coupled with the difficulty Hannah has had in getting Nono, 97 years young, as she says, and in a wheelchair, up to the resort, make it hard for Maxine to flatly deny them a room. It is in Act 2 that Shannon's fall from the pulpit is revealed. Slumped in a hammock with Hannah sketching him, he reveals that he was an ordained and seated reverend for a single year before being locked out of his church for both fornication and heresy. The theology Shannon has been developing while working as a tour guide is anything but orthodox. His vision of God is transmuted into a primeval force of nature, essentially uncaring to the fates or actions of humans. I want to go back to the church, he says, and preach the gospel of God as lightning and thunder. Hannah suggests that what some of his congregation will want simply is something to believe in, a theme that will return in the third act. At one point, confused by the activity, he is too deaf and blind to really hear or see, which is the arrival of the eponymous iguana, which, as a potential food source, is tied up just off stage. Nono begins declaiming his verses. In response to Nono, Shannon exclaims, "Fantastic," one of his favorite adjectives. And here Williams lays out one of the theological pillars of the play. There are two levels of existence, Shannon says, one realistic and the other fantastic. He further suggests that his spook is the result of living on the fantastic level, but needing to operate on the realistic level. Hannah, for her part, argues that both are real, another indication of her more advanced level of enlightenment, a quality, it might be noted, that it is extremely difficult to find a cognate for in much of Williams' other work, which makes the play stand out in this way alone. The conflict over Shannon by Maxine and Hannah continues in this act as well. Tensions between them escalate until, in the midst of arguing while Shannon is absent, Hannah demands the return of the wheelchair, insisting that she will leave with her grandfather immediately rather than stay where she is unwelcome and unwanted. This threat, made in the face of a rising storm, serves as an off-ramp to their anger and allows Maxine to get at her real concern, her desire for Shannon and seeing Hannah as a threat. With the conflict stated, a détente of sorts is achieved. Shannon returns to the stage, and the act ends with the storm building in fury. "Here is your God, Mr. Shannon," says Hannah. "Yes," he replies. "I see him. I know him." The third and final act begins after the storm has passed. Maxine opens the act, pressing her suit for Shannon and her to join together, and her position as the advocate for the earth and sensuality remain as strong as ever, yet tempered with movement towards something beyond the immediately gratifying. "I know the difference between loving someone and just sleeping with someone. We've both reached a point where we've got to settle for something that works for us in our lives, even if it isn't on the highest kind of level." Despite this, their pairing might offer the possibility of both levels being in play. Maxine receives some assistance in the form of a new character, Jack Latta, replacement tour guide. He's been instructed by Shannon's employers to take command of his lost tour. Shannon battles to keep his job, offering a lyric defense of his eccentric tour guide approach and a mirror of his unorthodox theology. God's world has been the range of my travels. I haven't stuck to the schedules of the brochures, and I've always allowed the ones that were willing to see, the underworlds of all places. And if they had hearts to be touched, feelings to feel with, I gave them a priceless chance to feel and be touched, and none will ever forget it, none of them ever, never. In his own way, Shannon has been trying to make certain of his customers masters of two worlds, the surface world and the underworlds of all places. If they had suitably heroic qualities, willing to see, hearts to be touched, feelings to feel with, then their experiences would stay with them for the rest of their days. Laudable as this might be, it is not what the passengers of his company are paying Shannon for, and he is quickly relieved of the bus key and his employment. He then attempts to rip the cross from his neck so that he can swim to China, meaning drown himself in the ocean, and this in turn causes another round of panic, ending with Shannon tied into his hammock. For Maxine, it is the regularly scheduled crack-up the stage directions in the front of the play predicted coming true. He cracks up like this so regular you can set a calendar by it, and she heads off to call town for a doctor. Hannah remains with him in what turns out to be both a Golgotha and Garden of Gethsemane, and where Williams is his most direct in his religious symbolism. Who wouldn't like to suffer and atone for the sins of himself and the world if it could be done in a hammock with ropes instead of nails, on a hill that's so much lovelier than Golgotha, the place of the skull, Mr. Shannon? You're still indulging yourself in your passion play performance. Shannon eventually manages to loosen his bonds and break free, and the cubicles of the Costa Verde resort now take on the qualities of the rooms in the French Quarter most sharply. The conversation between Hannah and Shannon becomes a transmuted variation on Nightingale and the Rider in Vieux Carré. Hannah confesses that what she believes in are broken gates between people so they can reach each other, even if it's just for one night only. When Shannon interprets this to mean a one-night stand, Hannah corrects him. One-night communication between them on a veranda outside their separate cubicles. You don't mean physically, do you? Shannon says, somewhat disappointed. No, she replies, a little understanding exchange between them, awaiting to help each other through nights like this. Hannah, in what is, despite its somewhat quiet nature, the climactic scene of the play, proves herself time and again to be the master of both worlds, not merely the spiritual realm she might seem to dwell in. When asked by Shannon about her experiences in earthly love, she confesses 2 episodes. The first was an unwelcome press of a knee when she was 16 in the back row of a movie theater. The second was altogether stranger, a sampan boat ride out of Singapore with an underwear fetishist who did not wish to touch her, but just hold, quote, the article he'd requested. She reports that she complied, and I looked the other way while his satisfaction took place. It is her response to the man's request, an act that marks Hannah as remarkable within the world of the play. When Shannon expresses incredulity that this counts as a love experience in her book, she affirms that it does. Nothing human disgusts me, she says, unless it's unkind, violent. Closely paraphrasing the Roman comic playwright Terence's aphorism, nothing human is alien to me. However, she continues with a smile, I do grant you, it was on a fantastic level. Struck by her, Shannon makes a final play for physical intimacy between he and Hannah, but she rebuffs him. Save it for the widow. It isn't for me. On a different track, Shannon suggests that he and Hannah simply travel together, but Hannah is again the master of 2 worlds, or 2 levels. I think the impracticality of the idea will appear much clearer to you in the morning, Mr. Shannon. Morning can always be counted on to bring us back to a more realistic level. Finally, on a microcosmic level, Hannah and Shannon play God. They set the iguana free. It has remained tethered throughout the storm and its aftermath, and its sounds have alerted Hannah to its existence just off stage. Shannon, at Hannah's urging, takes the machete that has been used to chop the tops off of coconuts to make rum cocos and severs the rope tying the iguana to the porch. As soon as the iguana is free, Nano completes the poem he has been working on throughout the play, calling for Hannah to come and write it down. As a fun Williams tidbit, Hannah promises to send it off to Harper's as soon as she gets it typed up. This is the same magazine that refused to publish the short story Night of the Iguana that Williams based the play on. Nono's labors are now at an end, and he can finally rest. In this case, his earthly duties have been discharged, and his death is imminent. But before he goes, we see Shannon and Maxine find each other. Maxine, the representative of the realistic plane, has also achieved her sort of apotheosis. In Williams's description, it is apparent that the night's progress has mellowed her spirit. Her face wears a faint smile which is suggestive of those cool, impersonal, all-comprehending smiles on the carved heads of Egyptian or Oriental deities. At first, she's alarmed that Shannon is free of the hammock and missing, but he promptly emerges. I cut loose one of God's creatures at the end of the rope. A little act of grace, Maxine. Maxine is not angry and suggests that they both go to the beach and swim in that liquid moonlight. I can make it down the hill, but not back up, Shannon says, in reference to his still present physical infirmities. I'll get you back up the hill, Maxine guarantees. The stage directions then indicate that Shannon chuckles happily. They are now on the path, which could easily be seen as the path towards enlightenment, a melding of the realistic and fantastic levels. Despite Shannon's central role in the play, it is Hannah that Williams leaves us with at the end, confronting her labor and life. Oh God, she says, can't we stop now? Finally, please let us. It's so quiet here now. Perhaps in answer to the prayer, Nono breathes his last, and our final image is of Hannah slowly bringing her head down to rest on Nono's as the curtain falls. The Night of the Iguana is a bit like an onion. It's deceptively simple, it has lots of layers, and it's likely to make you cry if you start to cut into it. Williams crafted a mortal passion play. The characters pass through suffering and emerge reborn in what can safely be said to be one of Williams' most hopeful stories. Our trio are not greeted with destruction, disaster, cannibalism, I'm sorry we couldn't get to Suddenly Last Summer this evening, a doctor coming to take them away, or a life of only glass ornaments to keep one company, but a hope that by moving between the two planes of the realistic and the fantastic, something akin to grace can be achieved. It isn't the Roman Catholicism that his brother Dakin would have heard preached, but it is, in this moment, perhaps as true a catechism of Williams's beliefs as might be found. And given that I worry that some of you might be echoing Hannah's final line and praying that we can stop now, this seems like an excellent note to end on. Thank you so much for your invitation and kind attention and the chance to spend some time with you and Williams. It is a true treasure, and I welcome your thoughts and impressions. Thank you very much. Do I stay? Do we go? Sure, yeah.
I'm sure Dr. Holtkamp would be glad to answer some questions if you would like to. A little bit. She's giving you a little bit to think about, right? Any questions come to mind? Anything you want to? It seems like his.
Would you say that Tennessee Williams was in quest of God to the end of his life?
It's an interesting question because certainly his level of spiritual engagement was pretty constant over the course of his life. He was always someone who was sort of looking for something. He was constantly on the move. He never settled in one place at one time. The unsettled sort of nature of his own existence, sort of coming to terms with his own sexuality and then having to navigate that, certainly left him in a position to sort of quest for things. Roman Catholicism was definitely not the answer for him, and so he continued to sort of look for other ways to address those questions of spirituality. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you speak a little about Suddenly Last Summer and Sebastian's episode on the beach?
Sure. So Suddenly Last Summer is Gothic, what one might say. It has its own sort of tortured both production history on stage and on screen. And it's certainly an episode of where that the level of very real danger that Williams could perceive in being homosexual and existing in the world is made both physically manifest by the indiscretions of the character, and then also the fact, again, for those of you that are unfamiliar, it ends in cannibalism. Like there's rending of flesh and whatnot. Which he would argue is supposed to be metaphoric, and he complained that the movie made it too literal, but it says cannibalism, so there's that whole thing. But he's trying, again, to find a way to encode, to a certain sense, the tension that he himself felt. An analogous tension that shows up a lot, which I only touched on very briefly here, is the statutory rape, right? So it's an illegal sexual contact between two people. The student that Shannon, the preacher in Night of the Iguana, sleeps with, is very specifically, well, I think he says, she's 17. She's a month from 17. She's almost 17, right? And one of the problems that he faces is that Mrs. Fellows has called back to Texas and sworn out a warrant against him for statutory rape. Now, of course, at the time, being homosexual was also illegal. It was something that could get you thrown in jail. And so he in a weird sort of way, it was much easier to sort of talk about it either in the sort of hugely overt, nearly parodic camp style of Suddenly Last Summer, where it's so over the top and ridiculous that it gives you some room to move. Or it's in this particular type of crime, which particularly at that time was greeted with much more forgiveness. But it was still another way to sort of encode that same sense of transgression. Does that help? Does that answer it all? Yeah. You're all like, Suddenly Last Summer, I'm adding that to my reading list. Or, let it have you steer clear, one way or the other.
Well, over and over again, we can see in his plays, that got himself and Rose and Edwina, all of the people in his life are characters in this play. In Last Act, of course, it's always his time. But when I think about Streetcar Named Desire, which is raw and ugly in so many ways, which of the characters do you think is he writing himself?
So most people would say that it's aspects of Blanche and aspects of Stella, actually. So the same sort of just raw magnetism that Stella and Stanley have for each other was, a machismo that he found himself, in some cases dangerously attracted to. The opening bit where we first see Stella and Stanley, he threw in almost entirely for his own amusement. Again, for those of you who, it's been a while. The play opens, we see the set, we've got Eunice and her black neighbor sort of like, again, taking the air on the steps in New Orleans. Stanley comes on stage, he yells for Stella to come out, and he yells out, "Meat!" He throws this package of meat up at her, which is clearly sexual. Williams would burst into laughter every time he went and saw a production of this show. He was like, that is hilarious. And it's made clear, even if you don't catch it the first time, because it is a source of enormous laughter for Eunice and her neighbor, right? Who says, like, what did he say again? Meat? But there's no question mark. It's exclamation point. Like, they know exactly what's happening. So that sort of like just raw erotic fascination was certainly an aspect of Williams that he wrote into the character. And then the level of storytelling, the desire for a much more poetic life, was something that was, again, very much a part of his own experience. I mean, he went through life as Tennessee, though he was born Tom. And sort of navigating that, dreaming something into reality, adds a lot of the sympathy that you get for Blanche, I think, in the piece. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll hang out up front. If you want to ask more about cannibalism, happy to chat about with you. Otherwise, thank you again so much for coming out tonight. Again, it's a huge honor.